Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
For nearly 4 decades, Benny Hill was Britain's court jester, the man who made the whole world laugh. At its peak, his show pulled in over 21 million viewers on a single night, a number that rivaled royal broadcasts and championship football matches. Families gathered around their television sets every week to watch a round-faced, grinning man in various ridiculous disguises chase, stumble, and mug his way through sketch after sketch. The laughter was real. The love was genuine. And for a long time, it seemed like nothing could stop him. But television, like all cultural institutions, is a living thing. It breathes, evolves, and sometimes turns on the very people it once celebrated. What happened to the Benny Hill Show in the late 1980s was not simply a cancellation. It was a cultural verdict. And at the center of it all was a single type of comedy, a single style of humor, and one moment in time when the tide of public opinion finally crested and came crashing down. To understand how it happened, you have to understand the man, the machine he built, and the world that eventually decided it had seen enough. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, England, a port city with a working-class soul and a no-nonsense attitude toward life. His father ran a surgical appliance shop, a far cry from the glamour of show business, but humor ran in the family bloodline. His grandfather had been a circus clown, and perhaps that spirit skipped a generation before landing squarely in young Alfred. From an early age, he was drawn to making people laugh, though his path to doing so professionally was anything but direct. Before he ever set foot on a stage, Hill worked as a milkman, a bridge operator, a truck driver, and even a drummer. These weren't wasted years. They were research. Every character he later portrayed on screen, every hapless everyman caught in an absurd situation, was drawn from the rich tapestry of ordinary British life he had lived firsthand. He understood working people because he had been one. And that authenticity gave his comedy a grounded warmth that audiences instinctively trusted. His real education in performance came during World War II, when Hill served in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers before transferring to the Combined Services Entertainment Division. Here, performing for troops in barracks, tents, and makeshift theaters across Europe, he learned the most fundamental lesson of comedy: timing. An audience of soldiers who had seen real horror needed laughter that was immediate, physical, and unambiguous. Hill delivered it. Night after night, he found what worked and quietly discarded what didn't. When the war ended, Hill emerged with a stage name borrowed from his idol, the great American comedian Jack Benny, and a set of instincts sharpened by 2 years of performing under pressure. He made his radio debut on Variety Bandbox in October 1947, and within a few years, had transitioned to the new and electric medium of television. When The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, it arrived not as an experiment, but as a statement. Hill knew exactly what he wanted to do. And for a very long time, the public agreed with every word of it. The show's format was deceptively simple. Hill combined the energy of British music hall tradition, broad characters, physical gags, rapid-fire pace, with the intimacy that television uniquely offered. Viewers weren't watching from the back of a theater. They were sitting inches from the screen, close enough to catch every raised eyebrow and every perfectly timed pause before a punchline landed. Hill exploited that intimacy masterfully. His face was his instrument, and he played it with the precision of a concert musician. Over time, the show developed a rich ensemble of recurring characters and collaborators. Jackie Wright, the tiny, bald-headed actor who served as Hill's perpetual target for his infamous head-slapping routines, became one of British television's most recognizable comic foils. His stoic, dignified reactions to Hill's increasingly absurd provocations were a comedy education in themselves. The straight man, properly played, is just as skilled as the clown, and Wright proved it every single week. The show's signature finale, the madcap chase sequence set to the frantic horns of yakety sax by Boots Randolph, became so embedded in the cultural vocabulary that it transcended the program itself. If you wanted to suggest that something had descended into pure comedic chaos, all you needed to do was hum those opening bars. In 2015, a full quarter century after the show had been canceled, that piece of music was voted the #1 television theme in an ITV special. That is the kind of cultural staying power that very few entertainers ever achieve. When the show moved from the BBC to Thames Television in 1969, it entered its golden era. Rather than weekly half-hour broadcasts, Hill was given the time and resources to produce hour-long specials. The production values rose. The sketches grew more elaborate. And the international audience exploded. The show was eventually broadcast in over 140 countries, making Benny Hill one of the most recognized comedic faces on the planet. In the United States, the syndicated version became a genuine phenomenon, earning Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Variety in both 1980 and 1981. In France, in Japan, in Brazil, in countries where English was barely spoken, people laughed at the same gags, the same chases, the same gleefully naughty humor that had made British living rooms howl for decades. But even during the years of triumph, something was quietly shifting beneath the surface. In the early 1980s, a new addition to the show crystallized both its appeal and its vulnerability. Hill's Angels, a dance troupe of young, attractive women who appeared in choreographed routines and comedic sketches, became a defining feature of the program during this period. For fans of the SH,
they were simply part of the fun, a colorful element of the variety format Hill had always embraced. For a growing number of critics, however, they represented something more troubling: the systematic reduction of women to decorative objects, present on screen primarily to be ogled, chased, and used as props for male comedic fantasies. It is important to understand the era in which this tension was developing. The 1980s were not the 1950s. The feminist movement had fundamentally altered the landscape of cultural criticism. Questions about how women were represented in media, in advertising, in film, on television, were no longer fringe concerns. They were mainstream conversations happening in newspapers, on university campuses, in living rooms across Britain. A show that had once seemed cheerfully harmless was now being viewed through a sharper and less forgiving lens. The specific sketch that crystallized the backlash featured Hill at the center of a crude parody of a beauty pageant format. Scantily clad women were presented, evaluated, and treated as objects of humor. The joke relied entirely on the audience sharing a particular view of women, that their primary value was physical, that their discomfort or humiliation was inherently comedic, that the male gaze was the natural and unquestioned center of any such scenario. In earlier decades, that assumption had been so widespread as to be invisible. By the late 1980s, it was impossible to ignore, and for many viewers, impossible to laugh at. Thames Television received complaints. Critics wrote pointed reviews, and the cultural conversation around the show shifted from celebration to interrogation. The figure who brought that interrogation into sharp public focus was Ben Elton, a comedian of a completely different school, sharp-tongued, politically engaged, and deeply committed to what was then called alternative comedy. Where Hill's humor was visual, physical, and rooted in music hall tradition, Elton's was verbal, confrontational, and explicitly political. The two men represented not just different comedic styles, but entirely different philosophies about what comedy was for and who it served. In January 1987, Elton went public with his criticisms in Q magazine and elaborated on them during television appearances, most notably on Saturday Live. His central argument was pointed and provocative, that the Benny Hill Show did not simply reflect sexist attitudes, but actively reinforced them. By presenting women as objects of pursuit and mockery, week after week, in front of tens of millions of viewers, the show, he argued, contributed to a broader cultural environment in which women were unsafe and disrespected. The reaction was fierce and divided. Supporters of Hill pushed back hard. One writer in The Independent described the criticism as resembling the spectacle of an elderly uncle being kicked to death by young thugs, suggesting that Elton and his allies were punishing a harmless old entertainer for the crimes of a culture he barely controlled. GQ magazine ridiculed the logic of holding a television comedian responsible for societal attitudes toward women, comparing it to blaming concert pianists for elephant poaching, a deliberately absurd analogy, but one that captured the frustration of those who felt the criticism had lost all sense of proportion. The truth, as it so often does, sat somewhere between these extremes. Hill was not a predator. He was not a misogynist in any deliberate or malicious sense. He was a man who had grown up with a particular kind of humor, had refined and performed it for 40 years, and had never seriously questioned whether the world it depicted was one that all viewers actually wanted to see. The problem was not that Hill was evil. The problem was that his comedy had become a time capsule, a perfectly preserved artifact of attitudes that the world had moved on from. And time capsules, however lovingly assembled, are not the same as living entertainment. The Broadcasting Standards Council entered the conversation around this time, and their comments were notably more measured than the combatants on either side. A spokesman acknowledged that public perceptions of comedy were evolving, and that material once considered merely cheeky was increasingly being experienced as offensive, particularly by women. This was not a moral condemnation of Hill, but it was a quiet acknowledgement that the cultural ground had shifted irrevocably beneath him. Inside Thames Television, these external pressures combined with internal financial realities to create an increasingly difficult environment for the show to survive in. By the late 1980s, viewer numbers had declined significantly from the extraordinary peaks of the early 1970s. Audiences were fragmented across more channels, tastes were diversifying, and the kind of broad, universal comedy Hill excelled at was facing competition from newer, more targeted forms of entertainment. Each episode of The Benny Hill Show was reportedly costing in the region of £450,000 to produce, an enormous investment for a program whose ratings were no longer what they once were, and whose advertising revenues were suffering accordingly. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The show had become too expensive to justify and too controversial to defend without reservation. In late May 1989, after 21 years with Thames Television and a run that had generated an estimated £26 million for the network, largely on the back of its extraordinary success in the American market, the decision was made. The Benny Hill Show was canceled. The announcement landed with surprising quietness given the scale of what was ending. There were no farewell specials, no retrospective tributes, no ceremonial final episode. The show simply stopped. Hill, by all accounts, was devastated. He had poured his entire adult life into those specials, writing much of the material himself, obsessing over every detail of timing and performance. To have it ended not by his own choice, but by an executive decision, was a wound that never fully healed. The aftermath was painful to observe for those who had loved the show. Hill attempted to move forward with new projects. In 1991, he began developing a concept called Benny Hill's World Tour, which would have seen him performing his comedy in countries around the world where his original show had found devoted audiences. Only one special was completed, Greetings from New York, which featured his familiar ensemble, including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. It was later billed as his final television appearance. Hill's health had been deteriorating for some time. In February 1992, he suffered a mild heart attack. Doctors recommended bypass surgery. He declined. He was subsequently diagnosed with kidney failure and again refused invasive treatment. He continued to live quietly and independently in his flat in Teddington, a private man in a way that had always contrasted sharply with his exuberant public persona. On the morning of April 20th, 1992, Benny Hill passed away in his armchair, watching television. He was 68 years old. His body was found 2 days later. The cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. On that same day, a new contract offer from Central Independent Television arrived at his home. The timing was, in its way, almost unbearably poignant. Britain had rejected him, and then, just as it was preparing to take him back, he was gone. What are we to make of all of this now, with the distance that time affords? The cancellation of the Benny Hill Show was not simply a corporate decision driven by ratings and budgets, though it was those things too. It was a cultural moment, an instance where a society publicly reconsidered something it had long accepted and decided that acceptance was no longer adequate. That process is not always fair to the individuals caught within it. Hill paid a heavy personal price for embodying a form of comedy that had outlived its cultural permission to exist. Whether or not that was just as a question worth sitting with. What is certain is that Benny Hill's talent was extraordinary and real. His ability to create and inhabit characters, to find the precise rhythm of a physical gag, to write material that could simultaneously work for a factory worker in Birmingham and a truck driver in Texas. These were genuine gifts, honed over decades of disciplined work. The show entertained an entire planet. At its best, it was a masterclass in the kind of populist comedy that takes real skill to produce and real warmth to deliver. The controversy that ended it does not erase that legacy, but it does complicate it in ways that honest reflection requires us to acknowledge. The Benny Hill Show was a product of its time, deeply, irreducibly so. When its time passed, the show passed with it. That is perhaps the most human story in all of entertainment. The artist who gives everything to their work, only to find that the world has quietly moved the finish line while they weren't looking. In November 2021, That's TV announced that the Benny Hill Show would return to nationwide British television for the first time in nearly 20 years, as part of their Christmas schedule. The audience that tuned in did so with nostalgia, with fondness, and in many cases with the complex mixture of laughter and discomfort that honest cultural memory produces. They were watching something that had once been beloved, and that remains, whatever else it may be, the work of a singular and unforgettable man. The scene that took the show off the air was not really a single sketch at a single moment in time. It was the accumulated weight of decades of choices, finally met by a world that had grown unwilling to keep laughing along. The ending, when it came, was quiet, but the echo of that yakety sax still plays, faintly, somewhere, in the corridors of television history, and probably always will.